Welcome, everyone, to our live stream today. I'm Erica Shaker, Director of the CCPA National Office. I would like to begin by acknowledging that our national office is located on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. The Algonquin peoples have lived on this land since time immemorial. We are grateful to have the opportunity to be present in this territory and commit as settlers to work to dismantle colonialism and racism and to uphold the treaties that govern this land. This week marks a year since COVID-19 was declared a pandemic. And like so many of you, we at the CCPA continue to work from home during these unprecedented times. But when it comes to fighting for progressive public policy, we've never been busier. For months now, our experts have been at the forefront of the national policy debate about how best to respond to the crisis and how to ensure a just and sustainable recovery. And we've been pleased to see many of our ideas and concerns addressed by the federal and provincial governments. Women have been frontlined and sidelined by the pandemic in their roles as primary caregivers and care workers, and the majority of workers in sectors hardest hit by the ongoing economic shutdowns. The federal government has promised an action plan for women in the economy, but will it deliver? And this brings me to our guests. Katherine Scott is senior researcher with our national office and director of our Making Women Count project. Katherine just released Women, Work, and COVID-19 Priorities for Supporting Women and the Economy. Anjum Sultana is the National Director of Public Policy and Strategic Communications with YWCA Canada. She is also co-author of Canada's first feminist recovery plan. Today, Katherine and Anjum will be leading a discussion of the economic crisis, the Canadian response to date, and what we can expect in the upcoming federal budget. But before we bring Anjum and Katherine on, I'd like to tell you about how you can get involved in today's conversation. We've arranged two different ways for you to submit your comments and questions during this live stream. The first is using the YouTube chat box, which you can see on the right side of your screen right now. If you already have a YouTube or Google account, click where it says "Say Something" and type in your question or comments. Everyone watching the stream right now can also see the live chat, so please feel free to strike up a conversation with other viewers. If you don't have a YouTube or Google account, or if you prefer to submit a question privately, you can send us an email at outreach@policyalternatives.ca with the subject line "question." Either way you choose, our moderators will compile your questions behind the scenes, and we will do our best to get to all of them before the end of the stream. So please don't be shy. Start typing your questions into the chat box or send them to us by email at any time, and we'll try to get to them in the conversation. If we receive more questions than we can get to within the hour, that gives us plenty of reason to host another conversation like this in the future, and we look forward to that. This live streaming business is new for us, so please bear with us if any technical issues come up. And if you have feedback about the stream or suggestions for future topics you'd like to see, please do let us know. So while questions are coming in, I'll ask our guests to kick things off. Let's start with Katherine. I am hoping, Katherine, that you can provide some context for us today. Your report looked at the economic fallout from the pandemic over the last year. Can you summarize your high-level findings on the pandemic's impact on women's economic participation and security?
Thank you, Erica. I'm so pleased to be here and to be hosting this conversation during International Women's Day week, and to have the chance to chat with Anjum and with our viewers as well. Looking very much forward to this. This does feel like a moment right now for women in the economy. I'm actually heartened for as hugely difficult as this past year has been. This week, there is a moment of leavening. There's a heartening. Women are meeting across the country. They're meeting across the world. As we speak, the UN Commission on Status of Women is convening virtually in New York, all of these amazing activists, advocates, and researchers are focusing on the key question of how do women come back? How do we address this massive crisis in women's employment in Canada and around the world? So a moment I found it's a hopeful moment in what's been a hugely difficult year. And there's no question, I'm going to outline in a couple of slides some of the key takeaways from the report we've just released. There's no question that women have shouldered the largest economic losses during this past pandemic. Female majority sectors were hit very, very hard last spring. by the end of April, 1.5 million women had lost their jobs, and another million had actually had over half of their working hours cut. 2.5 million women. It actually totaled roughly 30% of the entire female labor force were impacted by COVID losses. And these are staggering numbers. But we know that the largest losses were occasioned or occurred for women working in low-wage jobs, a workforce we know that is largely racialized, within which immigrant and newcomer women are represented, women with disabilities, those with lower levels of education. So the lowest wage workers were hit hardest. In one of the most shocking statistics we found this past year certainly was that over half, 58% of all women earning less than $14 an hour lost their jobs between February and April last year, as compared to only 7% of women in the highest income or earnings bracket of $48. That's extraordinary disparity. So looking forward, and by year's end, certainly there had been and has been a recovery, but as we said, on the whole, in the aggregate, women were still working 8% fewer hours than they were before the pandemic. And the rate of employment among all women was 2.7% percentage points lower than it had been in February. In fact, that's a level that we hadn't seen since the year 2000. So we're still at that level. Employment rates among women are still much lower. And we know, of course, the recovery's been as unequal as the downturn. So looking forward to the next slide. Sorry, I'm supposed to be telling Hadrian when to move the slides, and I have dropped the ball already on this. So this chart right here, as I'll say, tracks women's employment rates. You can see obviously what's happening at the very end of the year. And if we move forward, looking at the recovery, as you're just saying, pointing out that certainly we see that the recovery certainly is proving to be as unequal as the downturn. We see in particular that workers in vulnerable sectors, and that includes food and accommodation, retail and the trades, information and culture, in those particular sectors have been really slow to come back. In fact, people have talked about a K-shaped recovery, and we can see that here. So there's one group of workers, and those of us in the knowledge sector and the like, who didn't miss a beat. They've basically had experienced some measure of loss in the spring, and they have actually more than recouped all of their employment losses. But of course, those workers in vulnerable sectors, and that's what you see here with the red line, experienced some much deeper losses, recovered through this summer up to August, but this goes up to December. They're still 17 percentage points below in terms of employment. That actually continued this past in January, snapped back a bit. Today's job report said there was a snapback in February, but women in those industries and low-wage jobs are still roughly 20% below levels than they were before the pandemic. And again, if we look at the next slide, it's marginalized women who are bearing these losses, who are struggling and involved in the ongoing stress that's attached to that. This chart here looks at employment rates and unemployment rates by among racialized women and non-racialized women, and we see that the gap is significant. The first point, like back in the summer, it was a difference of 7 percentage points employment between racialized and non-racialized. It's still, that narrowed slightly, but it's still a significant gap in rates of employment and unemployment. The other, of course, troubling trend, if we scoot forward, one more slide, is, of course, what's been going on the home front. There has been an unprecedented increase in unpaid work that women have taken on in the home. And certainly with no help forthcoming, women have stepped up to shoulder increases in homeschooling, care involved with people with illness and the like. And so it's no surprise to see that employment has been, or certainly the recovery has been very weak among moms with kids under 12. And that's what this chart shows. And of that group, single mothers are hugely impacted. They're carrying the largest losses, and particularly moms with kids under 6. And I should note that this particular chart doesn't actually talk about the number of women who've dropped out of the labor force altogether. By December, 160,000 women had left the labor force for various reasons. And in fact, that number hasn't changed in this morning's report. Actually, those numbers were still elevated. And that's 10 times the number of men who have dropped out to take care of caring responsibilities. And that's hugely worrying as we move forward about what's going to happen for this particular group of women, those who've dropped out, those who are marginalized, concentrated in vulnerable sectors of our economy moving forward. They have to be centered in any recovery plan. So I'll leave that there in terms of some context, Erica.
Thanks, Katherine. That was both a very quick and comprehensive overview. Really appreciate it. And now I'd love to bring in Anjum. Hey, Anjum, and we are so pleased you're joining us. Over the last year, governments in Canada have rolled out a massive response to help stabilize households and the economy. To what extent have these efforts been successful at meeting the needs of women and marginalized women in particular?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I think this is the question. Katherine alluded to the K recovery. We want to make sure whatever is being done, especially from the public purse, reaches the people who are most impacted. And I would say in the early days of the response, it was impressive to see and very well received, all of the incredible measures. But it always felt like gender and intersectionality was an afterthought. So I'll give you an example. So we have known for a number of years, and Katherine's past research talks about this as well, around how employment insurance doesn't work for everyone. Right? Employment insurance is very hard for women who are predominantly concentrated in precarious work to access that benefit. And so in the midst of the pandemic, another benefit was created to address some of the shortfalls of EI. But even CERB was well received by many communities across the country, but for folks who were precarious workers, for folks who were sex workers, for other marginalized workers, it was hard to access. So there were still challenges with respect to CERB, for example. I think also during the crisis, we've seen how much of our life has gone online. So for us, in many parts of the country, when a woman loses her job, she typically goes to YWCA to figure out what to do next. But if everything's becoming digital, and if folks don't have access to devices, how can they get the information they need, right? Access to internet, access to online information, that's something where we saw some barriers for many of the communities that we serve. I think, there's two key, understandings and reflections that people had during this crisis, how the health of our society is very much linked to the health of our economy. We can't have a healthy economy if our communities are sick or do not have access to everything they need. And we also realized how crucial personal security was for economic security. So across the country, what we've been seeing is that gender-based violence has been on the rise. There's been a rise in unpaid care work. We've seen that this is disproportionately hitting Black, Indigenous, racialized communities, newcomers, people with disabilities, young women. And I think what we were seeing is that a lot of policy solutions were addressing one of these issues, but not realizing that many of the people that we serve, for example, at YWCAs across the country, are dealing with all of those issues at the same time. So I'd say in terms of the policy responses, they were great. Many were quite quick to respond to the need, but still that intersectional analysis was missing. And so that's what I'm hoping to see in the recovery conversations. We don't forget that lens.
So you've seen there's been both, from your perspective at the Y, you've seen both good and challenging responses, I suppose. Did you want to develop any of that, or are there other? Yeah.
Absolutely. So one of the big areas that we have seen been challenging for the people we serve is around housing insecurity. So housing insecurity, so take, for example, Banff. We have a YWCA there. Housing is very much linked to employment. So in many parts of the country, when people were losing their jobs, especially in some tourism hotspots, they were also losing housing. So I think there was this connection we saw very immediately, for example, in Banff, how crucial housing is and how much of a connection there is to employment. But it also speaks to this larger troubling trend around increasing housing insecurity. We also saw how important that is for public health measures, right? You can't stay at home if you don't have a place to live, if it's not affordable, if it's not safe. So that was one element of this. I think something else that we saw was essential workers were keeping our economy going, but they were not being paid their fair share. So we saw temporary measures to increase pay, pandemic pay, for example, but some of them in some jurisdictions were short-lived, or they were not fully comprehensive enough for workers to really ensure that they had enough money to live on during this challenging time. I think also some of the challenges we saw was, and we saw this in long-term care homes, sometimes because of their employment arrangements, workers had multiple places of employment because they couldn't afford to live on just one employment contract that they had. Measures were put in place to ensure that people just stayed at one place of employment, but they didn't have enough income to go with that. And so those are some of the challenges we were seeing on the ground with the communities that we serve.
Thank you. Thanks, Anjum. Katherine, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
This is just such a great, important conversation. I think really getting down to looking at the government response, and I completely 100% agree with Anjum. We saw the federal government moving in with really important income security programs that had that provided fundamental support to low-wage families, and certainly those were precarious, and certainly our own analysis here at the CCPA has demonstrated that. But glaring holes, and on the care side, really hit and miss. Certainly, as we look across many of the provincial governments, I was struck doing an analysis and reading some of, like, from my report, like some of the recovery plans, and thought women didn't even figure at all. Like, it was really, like in the Alberta recovery plan, or even in BC, it was, so this whole sort of sense that, it was quite invisible, women's care label, regardless, for a real disconnect between what people were saying about women and their heroes and the heroic work they were doing as healthcare workers and the like, and obviously in care in the home, and yet the policies and programs looking at the crisis of their economic security were not forthcoming. Real gaps, and Anjum mentioned essential workers. Certainly on the child care front, those were really variable, the different provincial responses. The money that the federal government, for instance, put in place through the Safe Reopening Agreements last August was $625 million, which was a quarter of what advocates were saying was going to be needed to stabilize the system, given the precipitous loss of capacity. And, the childcare sector actually still in crisis, and we're releasing a report next week that looks at that. So really hit and miss. And, one of the themes that, you really come away, you have this conversation, women seem to be in the media, but when you peel it back, there's still this sense that women are the shock absorbers of the economy, that they're there always to step up and to take on this extraordinary amount of labor and work. And it's having a completely damaging consequences. We see rising levels of depression and anxiety, certainly among women, those with kids in particular. It's this really, crisis underneath the crisis, this shadow pandemic that's having a huge toll on families across the country. So, really agree that it's been a haphazard or hit and miss response to those issues so far.
Yeah, so the key question now, and I know this is of interest to our viewers, is what's needed at this moment, at this juncture. Anjum, can you tell us about the feminist recovery plan that the YWCA published last year? What are some of your priorities for action?
Yeah, and I will say also, this plan really came from the understanding that women, two-spirit, and gender diverse people have been the hardest hit. And as such, they need to be centered in recovery conversations. And for us, we believe that Canada can and should be leading the response around a gender just recovery and a feminist recovery. And I think part of the reason why we saw that haphazard approach earlier on in the pandemic was because we were using the traditional playbook, right? What happens in an economic recession? Let's do what we always do. And part of it is because previous recessions typically impacted men majority sectors more, or men workers. And so we were using and thinking about economic recovery through that lens. But because who has been impacted is different and the impact has been severe, we actually need a new playbook. And that's what the Feminist Economic Recovery Plan endeavored to do, a new playbook to address this new type of crisis before us. So within the recovery itself, and the slide may go up of the different pillars, we had 8 pillars and 27 recommendations. And it first started with the understanding we need to have an intersectional approach. We can't have a one-size-fits-all. Women have been most impacted during this crisis, but when you dig a bit deeper, and Katherine's report highlights this, it's been Black, Indigenous, and racialized women. It's been women living with disabilities. It's been younger women. It's been communities who have often been sidelined and disregarded even before the pandemic. those are the communities that we need to center even within this gendered focused conversation. So that's one of the big elements of this. And we need disaggregated data to do that. I think that was the challenge even writing this report, is to figure out who has been hardest hit, because that information is not collected across all jurisdictions in the same way. Other elements of the plan looked at the care economy. We also talked about the importance of decent work. One of the guardrails, for example, that Minister Freeland will be looking at is seeing how many jobs come back. And are they coming back to pre-COVID levels? For us, we want to ensure any jobs that come back are decent jobs with paid sick leave, and ensuring flexibility in the workplace, and ensuring proper wages for workers to ensure that they're compensated adequately for the incredible labor that they're providing to society. One thing I will highlight, and if for folks who want to see the full plan, you can check out feministrecovery.ca. One of the elements of our plan that was curious to people was the focus on something called the shadow pandemic, and that has been the rise in gender-based violence. For us, we cannot talk about economic recovery in a climate of hate, violence, and discrimination. And that's why we talk about the need for a national action plan to end gender-based violence, because we're actually seeing this across the country. Some folks have decided to take their businesses online, but they're still experiencing hate and misogyny online. So we're seeing, we can't have this economic recovery conversation without addressing all of these other things that make our society unhealthy. And so we really need to start to think about not just prioritizing GDP and jobs, but actually thinking about what actually makes a good life, a quality life. And so that's what the plan endeavored to do.
Thank you, both of you, for answering my questions. I know we have viewers who have their own questions, so let's turn to them. Don't forget, folks, you can email your questions to us at outreach@policyalternatives.ca. Here we go. This question is from the live chat. Thank you so much. What is the importance of childcare in rebuilding women's participation in the labor market? Will there be anything in the federal budget on this? Anjum, let's hear from you first.
Sure. So childcare. That's what we hear across the country. And this was before the pandemic. It doesn't matter if you're in Yellowknife, Vancouver, Prince Albert, Halifax, here in Ontario, where I'm currently based in Toronto. That was the number one concern. And it's heightened during this pandemic. We've seen unpaid care work go up. And so for us, absolutely, I think we will see something in the upcoming budget around childcare. The key is it enough, right? Is it enough money? Katherine alluded to the fact, even when we were getting money regarding stabilizing the sector, it was just a quarter of the amount needed. I think, childcare is important for a few things. First, it's important for women's labor market participation, which has dropped dramatically during this crisis. Two, it's actually a job creator. And at that, it's a low carbon job creator. So it can create hundreds and thousands of jobs directly for early childhood educators, indirectly for perhaps construction of childcare centers across the country, and enabling women back to work. So that's another element of this. And finally, it also can pay for itself. A recent study by Jim Stanford showed that it could potentially bring back to government $29 billion a year. So we see this as a win-win-win. The key is, will they take more of a market approach to childcare in the budget, or more of a public financing approach? And we hope it's the latter.
Katherine, do you have anything to add?
Absolutely. I mean, Anjum summarized the pitch for childcare. It's one of those things. We've been asking for childcare for 50 years. This crisis has illustrated once again its critical role in communities across the country, and yet it hasn't taken center stage. And, one looks at what's the natural experiments in Canada. We've seen 20 years of a progressive set fee system in Quebec, and what that's done by way of supporting women's participation in paid labor market and reducing child poverty and improving the health and well-being of children. And yet in the rest of Canada, we still struggle with largely market-driven systems that are hugely inequitable and extraordinarily expensive for families across the spectrum. So childcare must figure prominently in the conversation for recovery. And as Anjum said, it pays for itself. Really struck too that there's two things I'd like to say about childcare, certainly as it pertains to what's coming up in the budget and the ongoing discussion. Anjum touched on it. There's this real tension and debate around childcare about whether it should take the form of sending vouchers to parents to pay for need under the guise of parental choice, or whether we should be investing in the creation of a pan-Canadian system that's tailored and can meet the needs of children across the country, providing culturally appropriate, safe, stimulating support for kids. That's playing out. And the fact of the matter is, we have there's such a devastating lack of resources in childcare. We desperately need investments in the building out a childcare system. It's fundamental infrastructure that we need. I think the other piece, of course, is the federal-provincial tension, and that's going to play out in this budget. And that's certainly a critical issue around long-term care we talk about, and in other investments in the care economy, many of which, of course, governed by the provinces, the jurisdictions, such as they are in Canada. And finding ways to navigate that and to cooperate. There certainly was a moment of tremendous cooperation a year ago. Feels like there's not such a degree of cooperation at this juncture, and how much more time do Canadians have to wait for decent, high-quality caring services in their communities that are not held hostage to political whim and austerity agendas? So, there's a fight in front of us. I think childcare is important, but it remains a question as to what form that's going to take and how the provinces are going to collaborate and cooperate.
Folks, this is just a reminder that you can ask a question by entering it into the chat on the right-hand side of your screen, or by emailing us at outreach@policyalternatives.ca. And please don't be shy. We'd love to hear from you, and we'll do our best to get to as many of your questions as possible. The second question, from email, so thank you very much for that. What are some municipal and provincial policy solutions that would impact women most hard hit by the pandemic? Katherine, let's start with you.
That's an interesting question. It sort of speaks to going forward to what we've seen. Of course, BC has stepped forward, I think, in terms of pandemic response. We're going to look at some of the services across the country of the different responses. British Columbia sort of was noteworthy early on, and some of the action it took to stabilize the long-term care and improve the quality of work in those workplaces, as people were restricted to single workplaces and offered full-time hours. And it really made a difference, certainly, to their efforts to not only containing the pandemic, but improving the quality of employment on offer to those, highly racialized, low-wage working women. So I think we do have actually some direction. You've seen Quebec move forward, making big investments in recruitment and training, looking at immigration, and again, settings as opposed to what's happened in Ontario. So, I think there have been some distinct differences. Going forward, I think the provinces have a huge role to play, certainly looking at what's going to be needed by way of training and support, including post-secondary education for many workers that are being marginalized and left behind. I worry that many of these jobs may not be coming back. They're certainly not coming back in the format they currently exist in, and yet Canada's got a pretty bad track record on those types of programs, training. Many of even the training programs that currently exist are really gender segregated to the extent women are taught to be hairdressers which nothing against that, but limited options. We really have to rethink that and think about where's the economy going? How can we move and improve the quality of training and employment on offer for these groups, and women in particular, who will be facing long-term struggle, long-term challenge as the labor market shifts.
Thanks, Katherine. Anjum, I have a question for you. Can you share some more details about Black, Indigenous, and racialized women's experiences?
Yeah, so I would say one of the big things has been that for generations, Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities have said what they would want to see. Thinking about the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. These are some of the things that if we had put into place before the pandemic, perhaps some of the economic, social, and health consequences of this pandemic would have been felt the disparities we have seen would have been reduced or perhaps addressed completely. So I think during this crisis, one of the things we've seen is Black, Indigenous, racialized communities have been overrepresented in essential occupations, but they have not received essential wages. They have not been received the proper due for the life-affirming work that they have provided to us as a society and as an economy. I think we've also seen challenges for women-led businesses, especially businesses led by Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities. So we've seen, some measures around a women's entrepreneurship strategy, a Black business entrepreneurship strategy, but we've seen large-scale losses of contracts, clients, and it's been really challenging for businesses, small businesses during this time. So that's something else that we've seen across the country in some of the work that we do. We've also seen just the systemic racism that was plaguing our society well before has heightened. So even for folks that are haven't experienced that economic loss, there have been challenges around advancement, around ensuring proper pay. So these are some of the things that we have seen. And I think it's incumbent upon us, and I would say especially, we may get into this a bit more, the task force for women in the economy to have a racial justice lens, to ensure that the solutions that they put forward look at it through a lens of how do we actually also tackle systemic racism along with systemic sexism as well. I also wanted to quickly answer the question you had before, just around what types of solutions provinces and municipalities can do. So two things. One is around social procurement. Provinces as well as municipalities are in corporations. They do business. They also have spending power in terms of where contracts go, where they decide to spend their money. They should look at that through an equity lens, thinking about how they can invest in Black, Indigenous-led organizations, organizations led by people with disabilities. This is a role that they can play, but then they can also ensure that others that do business with them or interact with them also adhere to. So right now, for example, the government of Canada is pushing out a 50-30 initiative where they want on boards 50% women and 30% people from diverse equity-seeking groups. Let's actually apply that to social procurement as well, right? So that's an element of this. I also want to touch on the conversation around reskilling. I think reskilling is very important, especially through a gender lens, because Katherine is absolutely right. Many of the jobs that were lost, we may not get back. So we need to transition people to new sectors. But we also need to ensure that they actually have wraparound supports. If a reskilling program is offered, but there's no access to childcare, even if someone wants to access that program, they may not be able to. We need to also think about ensuring a trauma-informed approach. I was mentioning before, we support a lot of people across the country facing multiple challenges. So even in the design and delivery of these employment and reskilling programs, we have to have that trauma-informed lens. So it's not just kind of throwing money at the issue, but thinking about these programs in a very thoughtful, intentional way.
Thank you, Anjum. If you're just joining us now, my name is Erica Shaker. I'm the director of the CCPA National Office, and I'm joined today by CCPA senior researcher Katherine Scott and Anjum Sultana from YWCA Canada, and we are discussing the impact of COVID-19 on women in Canada and what we should do about it. This next question came in over email as well, and I would love to hear from both of you about it. What are your other top priorities for spending in the federal budget? Katherine, let's start with you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Erica. Other top priorities, there are many. Certainly, one of the most pressing priorities that faces the federal government right now is the reform of employment insurance. We have a set of temporary rules that have been brought in when they wound CERB down, and brought in new rules for EI in order to vastly expand coverage of workers, particularly those self-employed or who have few hours, who have historically not been eligible for the program. They also, of course, introduced a minimum floor, the $500 per week. That was the level that was provided under CERB, which again boosted incomes of families that are relying on employment insurance, and have taken measures to also extend benefits. And these have been really critically important to retool, but they're temporary. They're set to phase out. And the government, the federal government, for many years now has had EI reform on the books. In fact, we've known EI has been broken the minute it was reformed in the 1990s. I'm old enough to remember when that happened and like arguing against the committee when that came down, saying how many women would be disenfranchised or disentitled paying into that program, yet not able to actually receive benefits. So EI reforms are really top priority because clearly the set of income support systems, which are fundamental to people's economic security in Canada, are not designed and do not accommodate workers at this point in time, like just full stop. They are profoundly flawed. So we need to move forward with reforms, making permanent some of the gains that we've received, including introducing a much lower eligibility criteria that's consistent across the country so that workers can access this fundamental support. The other piece, and I would put this on, that I'm looking at seeing, and it's again bringing a feminist intersectional lens, is, and the government has flagged it, is around disability benefits. And it has been and remains a complete travesty, the invisibility of the struggles of people with disability, a huge number of whom rely on provincial social assistance systems, who have struggled with incredible difficulties accessing personal protective equipment or medications, who've had home supports and community supports that they rely on for their daily lives, obviously disappear or erode through the past pandemic. One of the fundamental things the community has been pushing for a long time is to revisit disability benefits, which, are much, much below, poverty levels across the country. And so this is an opportunity with the new announcement around a new disability benefit that they're negotiating to really put in place a minimum income guarantee that affords dignity and adequate support, desperately needed support to people with disabilities. So those are two of my top priorities going forward for the budget.
Anjum, what about you?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with the number of the issues that Katherine raised. I think another element of this too is what keeps me up at night is what the impact of this crisis has been on young people, especially young women, in terms of during this pandemic. Gen Z women made up 2.5% of Canada's labor force, but experienced 17% of the losses. So we already know, and the evidence is quite clear, any disruption in terms of one's labor market participation has a scarring effect. Leaving the labor market for any period of time does have a scarring effect, but that is heightened the earlier on it is in your career. So I think about, folks are already facing challenges because they might not be going into work physically. Remote work is great in terms of flexibility and if you have access to internet and a device, but there is something lost in terms of that building of social capital, that building of networks, that other element to the work besides just the task itself. And now young people are primarily accessing that maybe through their computers, right? Even post-secondary education has been disrupted. So I think about not only is what is happening to young women in particular at this current point in time, but we know that they will actually experience the consequences of this time for the next 10 years. So I've been thinking a lot about the lockdown generation, if you will, or how do we prevent a lockdown generation? So that's one of the things that's been keeping me up at night. And I'd like to see some targeted gendered approaches to this and generational approaches in the upcoming federal budget.
Anjum, I feel like this next question was tailor-made for you, so I'm excited to hear your thoughts. Women's organizations and supportive services are seriously underfunded. How much of a challenge is this, and how can we advocate for change?
Yeah, such a brilliant question. And the person who wrote it kind of hit the nail on the head. These services are so essential, but have been underfunded historically, chronically underfunded. And so when the pandemic hit, yesterday was the 1-year anniversary of it being called a global pandemic. A lot of nonprofits and charities went into overdrive. They stepped up for their community. And the question is, have we stepped up for them? So they were delivering essential services like childcare and employment and reskilling programs, counseling, and so many other really vital services. But in a climate of COVID, with people also perhaps having more economic pressures on themselves, fundraising has been down, revenue sources have dried up. And so essentially, organizations are doing a lot with quite a limited means. And also, even when there was, funding available, it was really hard with everything else that they're doing to kind of sit down and go through that application process that could be quite complex, could be actually quite a lot of work for very limited funds, and then even the reporting requirements around that as well. So it's been quite difficult. One thing I will say that was launched earlier this year is a $100 million Feminist Response and Recovery Fund. The deadline currently is at the middle of March, so in a couple weeks. And so that is an opportunity, especially for feminist organizations, women's rights organizations, gender equity organizations to tap into that funding. But again, it's helpful, but is it enough? And also, are the requirements as well? Are people able to access that funding to its fullest extent? So I think one of the things we need now is not just addressing the needs of organizations in the temporary COVID period, but actually thinking about transformation. So thinking about how do we actually support organizations that need to completely reorient their services digitally, right? That costs money. So these are some of the things that we need to be advocating for government. We're seeing some responses, which is excellent, but we need to ensure that this is a long-term view, because again, many of these vital services were historically underfunded. So one of my hopes for this pandemic period, one of the legacies, is that we start to actually value these organizations that have given so much to community and actually put them in good stead for future crises as well.
Katherine, do you have anything to add?
Yes, this is a topic near and dear to my heart. I would say the nonprofit sector has flown under the radar on the pandemic. There were some really important initial investments, and we can flag the $100 million was designated to support gender-based violence organizations. That money flowed out and helped organizations pivot, purchase needed supplies and the like. There was money that certainly supported food banks and those in the food security sector, emergency supports for homelessness and homelessness shelters. But, there was a larger campaign for the range of nonprofits. It's a massive sector and employs upwards of representing 8% of GDP. But there was a range of supports needed to support a range of organizations, and governments did not step forward with stabilization funds. A lot of these organizations are still cobbling it together in the face of reduced revenues with the CEWS, with the wage subsidy program. Many were able to successfully apply for those monies, like childcare centers and the like. But those monies are set to wind down as well, and these organizations are in hugely precarious situations. They do not have administrative infrastructures that are up to the task because they've never been received or been able to access money to do precisely that. It's always been seen as some extraneous extra until you're in a crisis and you don't have IT systems that can pivot on a dime, and it's not something you can roll out in the space of 2 weeks to completely. So really, it has the crisis has shown the flaws and the fragility of the nonprofit system and the community sector in Canada. And the response, as I said, the CEWS is coming to an end, and I really worry what's next for many organizations. We've seen closures already, but my worry is that we'll see a wave of closures after we transition to this next period, unless governments and other funders step up and reorient. So yes, this is a critical priority, and one I hope the feds take seriously, certainly coming up and flag that in a more systematic and coordinated way that's been really absent to date.
Thanks, Katherine. Thank you so much, everybody watching, for your questions. This one actually came in over the live chat. This is the moment to win transformation of the care economy. How do we ensure momentum for building new systems is sustained? And do we need legislation? Katherine, why don't you start?
This is absolutely the moment. This is every day is the moment to refocus on the care economy, whether it's childcare, whether it's long-term care, whether it's attendant care, care economy. I would put education in that bucket, services that support gender-based violence. This sector has been hobbled and ignored and neglected. One of the recommendations, certainly coming from the CLC, which is Canadian Labour Congress and the like, is to strike a commission that focuses on the care economy. Certainly, I hope it's a particular focus of the new Women and the Economy Task Force, but really this is a multi-year agenda that we really need to take seriously, and that includes not only the quality of services that are offered, but the quality of working conditions. And we know, certainly from research like luminaries like Pat Armstrong, that quality working conditions are conditions of care, that this is the moment to really tackle that, and including the challenges which have stymied innovation between federal, provincial governments and new vehicles for moving that forward with significant investments that are needed to transition, certainly a pressing concern in the light of population aging. So this is absolutely the moment to move that forward.
Anjum, thoughts?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. So I'll say for the YWCA Federation, this is not the first pandemic we've experienced. We were there during the 1917 flu. And when we look through some of the archival information, it became very clear that in times of crisis, what matters more than anything is care and community. And so investing in care is something that we have needed. That's what's been saving us during this crisis. Childcare, long-term care, mutual aid networks, the social safety net, which is a form of care. So that's actually what should be guiding our post-pandemic recovery as well. And so for us, absolutely, this is where we need to actually focus our energies. And the thing is, this is also a job creator. When I think about childcare, the amount of jobs that we can get just from very limited investment, it's enormous. So imagine how much more we could get in terms of supporting our society and economy if we actually invested it at the levels we need. So in our Feminist Economic Recovery Plan, we talk a lot about ensuring that at least 1% of our GDP is focused on care. And I'm really pleased to hear about CLC's recommendation. I think that's the step in the right direction, because this is the future of work. There's all these conversations about the future of work, but you can't really have that future without the care that surrounds it and actually is the foundation of it. I also think about, we've been calling for this for 50 years, right? And we have this incredible policy window that has opened up. We have been talking about the problems for quite some time. I think there has been public consciousness raising because people are seeing that impact either someone they know or themselves has been dealing with the rise of unpaid care and so have seen the importance of this. We've also seen that there's solutions on the table. I think now we're seeing the politics also start to align on this. I think a perennial challenge, unfortunately, for the childcare conversation in Canada has been the political gridlock around jurisdictional issues. What should the federal government do? What should the provinces do? What should the territories do? So I would say, we're seeing some positive momentum at the federal stage. And I would also say for people who are watching, at your local municipality, in your provinces and territories, also raising the alarm, because we need alignment across all levels of government to really realize that full childcare system or care economy kind of focus. But now is the moment, and I think it's up to us and folks organizing in communities to take advantage of this moment to really push this agenda forward and also hold our politicians accountable. So I think this is our moment. So let's, my piece of the puzzle is how do we rise to this moment? And I think it's through that partnership between researchers, advocates, and activists to make it possible.
That is a perfect lead into what is going to be, I think, our last question this afternoon. The federal government has promised an action plan for women in the economy. Will it deliver? So Anjum, why don't you start?
So I think it will deliver if it ensures these three perspectives. One, it must be intersectional. So we can't have a one-size-fits-all approach. We need to have women in all their diversity being addressed by this task force and the recommendations that come forth. That's going to be vital, or else it will not deliver. The other element is it must be intersectoral. So, we were pleased to see, and I will say YWCA Canada CEO Maya Roy is one of the folks on this task force. We were pleased to see, there are some nonprofit charitable sector leaders, some sector leaders from the feminist movements. But, we want to make sure that that perspective is not marginalized on this task force. We know how crucial the care economy is for building a more inclusive society and more inclusive economy. And so we need to ensure that those types of perspectives are centered, valued, and highlighted in the recommendations of the task force. So that's another element of this. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the importance of intergenerational perspectives. I think we have seen how, I'll speak to perhaps the experiences of many millennials and Gen Z folks. They may have seen the 2008 recession. They're now dealing with the impact of this COVID-19 pandemic, and they will be left kind of figuring out what to do next for the next couple of generations. So I think it's really important to not just think about this task force, about what it can do in the here and now, but how its contributions can impact generations to come. So those are the three perspectives I'd like to see highlighted in the task force.
Katherine, what do you think about the action plan for women in the economy?
Oh, I'm just always listening to Anjum. It's great. That's exactly what needs to happen going forward to make sure that the task force is a success. This is such a critical question because, I'm struck, over the last couple of years in the face, certainly focusing on the federal level, there's been this discussion around this particular Liberal government being a feminist government and the types of policies that they brought in. We have proactive pay equity, pay transparency laws. There's been movement on violence in workplaces and the like. And but this ongoing conversation has, have we seen change on the ground? Like, is it translating? And, we've been stuck. Something like the pay gap, for instance, has really been stuck for 10 years. So like we've got these particular sets of policies that have come in, but is it really, is the rubber hitting the road? And, a lot of us have concluded, well, no, it's not. And partly because we haven't had those foundational investments in things that will really transform women's lives, like investments in the care economy, investments in rooting out the gender bias that is riddled through our income security systems and our tax system. Like, at the end of the day, is there change on the ground, or is violence being eliminated across the country and communities? Are we closing the gap? Are we raising employment standards? So it's significant. So we always, it's always that one step forward, two steps back. There's this tension at play. And I think really we're at the moment, this task force is a key signal that it's serious, certainly for the federal government. It's a serious focus of their budgetary efforts. But again, we'll have to see with the budget in terms of the dollars that are attached, because I think, and the meaningful action they'll take to actually make structural change, to make investments in communities like a pan-Canadian childcare system. Those will be the real litmus tests on whether they're putting gender at the center of their recovery planning.
Thank you. And much to my dismay, it's unfortunately time to wrap up. Anjum, Katherine, thank you so much for your time today. And thanks to our audience, all of you, for your fantastic questions. If you found this conversation useful, I hope you did. I know I did. Please consider making a donation so that we can continue to keep you informed on these policy issues. And so we can also keep hearing from you and answering your questions. There's a link in the video description below, or you can go to policyalternatives.ca/give. As I said at the outset, putting this live stream together has been a learning experience for us. So if you have any feedback about the stream or suggestions for future topics you'd like to hear from us on, please do let us know. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're looking forward to hearing from you soon. Enjoy the approaching spring weather. The snow is melting in Ottawa, and stay safe. Thank you.